Listen closely, because what Congressman Jared Moskowitz did in just 5 minutes dismantled an entire year of carefully constructed political spin, and he did it without ever raising his voice. There are specific, rare moments in Washington, D.C., when the very atmosphere of a room transforms before a single syllable is uttered. It happens when the air grows heavy with tense expectation, and every natural instinct signals that the impending events will be anything but standard procedure. This profound shift occurred on February 11th, 2026, within the walls of the House Judiciary Committee. It arrived not with explosive shouting or theatrical grandstanding, but with a piercing, silent stare. The hearing chamber was packed far beyond its standard capacity. In the gallery sat survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's exploitation, all dressed in pristine white. Their silent presence served as a devastating visual indictment of a broken justice system. News cameras were strategically positioned to record every micro-expression. Journalists leaned in, driven not merely by casual curiosity, but by a collective realization that something deeply unscripted was about to unfold. This was not the hearing that political insiders had bookmarked as a standard partisan bloodbath. Yet the gravity in the room felt infinitely denser than any scheduled clash. At the center witness table sat Attorney General Pam Bondi. She was flanked by a team of 3 sharp attorneys and accompanied by a massive binder, its pages meticulously organized with brightly colored tabs. She projected an image of absolute composure, rigorous discipline, and the quiet confidence of a seasoned official who believed she had already survived the day's most treacherous inquiries. Sitting directly across from her was Republican Congressman Jared Moskowitz. His calmness did not read as mere polite restraint. Rather, it was the unmistakable posture of profound, lethal preparation. He looked exactly like a man who fully grasped a fundamental truth. 5 minutes, if weaponized with absolute precision, can completely unravel months of meticulously curated talking points. To truly comprehend the seismic nature of what unfolded next, one must recognize that this interaction was not a cheap partisan ambush designed for social media applause. It was not the predictable, polarized bickering that dominates nightly cable news segments. Congressman Moskowitz and Attorney General Bondi shared a profound personal history. It was a background rooted not in political rivalry, but in shared tragedy, acute crisis, and moments when the brutal realities of public service required genuine bravery rather than calculated optics. 4 years prior, during his tenure in the Florida state legislature, Moskowitz received chilling news. A constituent had been apprehended possessing 2 rifles, a sniper scope, a silencer, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and a manifesto fueled by violent hatred. The only name explicitly listed as a target was Jared Moskowitz. His own children did not find out about this assassination plot from him. Instead, they heard the terrifying headlines repeated by classmates in their school hallways, an experience that violently dragged political extremism into the sacred sanctuary of his family's daily life. During that dark period, Pam Bondi was serving as the Attorney General of Florida. She actively ensured that the individual was prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent allowed by law. In response, Moskowitz had publicly expressed his deep personal gratitude to her for guaranteeing that violent intentions were met with the harsh realities of justice. That appreciation was authentic, well documented, and established a foundation of mutual respect. It made the events of February 11th utterly impossible to write off as standard political mudslinging. Furthermore, there was the shared trauma of Parkland. The horrific school shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School took place in Moskowitz's own hometown, forcing leaders from across the political spectrum to address unimaginable grief with concrete legislation rather than empty platitudes. Pam Bondi had thrown her support behind the bipartisan bill that was born from that tragedy, marking the most substantial state-level policy response to a school shooting in the history of the United States. Moskowitz remembered this collaboration clearly. He viewed it not as a compromise of political ideals, but as an exercise in shared moral responsibility. He launched his line of questioning that afternoon by bringing up these exact shared memories. He sincerely thanked Pam Bondi once again for aggressively prosecuting the man who had threatened his life and for standing firmly beside his grieving community in the aftermath of Parkland. His vocal delivery was highly controlled and deliberate. It was almost gentle, serving as a reminder to everyone present that basic human respect and demanding professional accountability are not mutually exclusive concepts. For a fleeting minute, it felt entirely possible that the dialogue might stay perfectly civil and procedural. Observers might have assumed that his expressions of gratitude would wrap up his time, allowing the hearing to proceed without any major disruptions. However, in a functioning democracy, gratitude and fierce accountability are not interchangeable currencies. Moskowitz understood perfectly well that honoring someone's past integrity does not provide a shield for their present contradictions. While other committee members had spent their time asking highly predictable questions regarding domestic security policies and the allocation of Department of Justice resources, Pam Bondi had remained seemingly unfazed. She appeared confident that the most explosive questions regarding the Epstein controversy had already been exhausted earlier in the day. She referenced her meticulously prepared notes with exact precision. She delivered highly polished, rehearsed responses with the steady rhythm of a veteran official accustomed to congressional oversight, projecting the absolute assurance of an administration convinced that its public narrative was impenetrable. What the Attorney General failed to anticipate was that Jared Moskowitz had absolutely zero interest in participating in theatrical outrage just to secure a spot on the evening news. When the clock started on his 5 minutes, the very air in the chamber mutated in a way that written transcripts can never fully capture. A collective tightening swept across the room, as if every person present intuitively knew the dialogue was violently shifting from vague political theories to hard, documented facts. He had opened with warm, shared history, but now he reached for a thick folder marked with red tabs. This physical action signaled that his upcoming remarks would not be framed as wild accusations, but as an undeniable, suffocating timeline of events. Attorney General Bondi, he started, his tone remaining perfectly measured but now laced with an undeniable, cutting resolve. From that exact second, the hearing ceased to be standard operating procedure. He explicitly highlighted the current administration's frequent, boastful claims of being the most transparent in the history of the American Republic. He allowed the heavy irony of that statement to hang suspended in the silent room, requiring no further embellishment. Before the current era, he pointed out, the concept of transparency was rarely invoked with such defensive frequency. This observation landed not as a humorous jab, but as a deeply calculated contrast to reality. Pam Bondi's facial expression held steady, but a microscopic adjustment of her hands on the witness table revealed that she recognized exactly where this line of questioning was heading. She knew the trap he was preparing to spring. He noted that a full 12 months had passed since high-profile political influencers were handed what was dubbed Part 1 of the Epstein documents. It had been 12 months since public statements teased that a definitive list was sitting directly on her desk, only for the administration to quietly release a memo shortly after, claiming that no such list ever existed. At this stage, Moskowitz wasn't even asking direct questions. He was simply acting as a legal architect, laying down fact after undeniable fact, building an impenetrable sequence that systematically destroyed any room for plausible deniability. He reminded the room that the president had publicly dismissed the entire Epstein controversy as a fabricated hoax. The president had even gone so far as to attack his own loyal voter base for demanding the full, unredacted release of the files, eventually attempting a bizarre maneuver to shift the blame onto Barack Obama, a deflection that left political analysts universally baffled. Moskowitz delivered every single detail with a calm, unraised voice. The cumulative impact was not like a sudden explosion. Rather, it was deeply suffocating, resembling the slow siphoning of oxygen from a locked vault. He continued his timeline, noting that members of their own party had actively voted against releasing the files within the Rules Committee. They had subsequently refused to even revisit that committee until highly specific procedural safeguards were implemented to protect them from having to vote on the issue ever again. Furthermore, the Speaker of the House had dismissed Congress a day early, right before a scheduled recess. In isolation, this might look like a standard administrative scheduling quirk, but when placed inside Moskowitz's growing timeline, it reeked of highly strategic evasion. The congressman then pivoted to the Department of Justice's internal actions. He noted that the Deputy Attorney General had held a private meeting with Ghislaine Maxwell. Shortly after Maxwell made public remarks that were surprisingly favorable toward the president, she was quietly transferred to a minimum security facility. This move occurred under highly unusual circumstances that were never transparently explained to the public. Simultaneously, the steady stream of internal leaks to the Wall Street Journal leaks that had previously driven immense public scrutiny abruptly stopped. This was yet another strange coincidence that, while perhaps not definitive legal proof of corruption on its own, severely magnified public suspicion when stacked alongside the rest of his devastating timeline. By the time Moskowitz laid out these points, the audience was no longer just casually listening. The room was vibrating with tension. The sound of reporters frantically striking their laptop keyboards echoed loudly. Lawmakers exchanged nervous glances that communicated a shared realization of the gravity of the moment. Pam Bondi made a brief attempt to speak and interject, but Moskowitz smoothly talked past her. He didn't do it with disrespect, but with a deliberate, unstoppable momentum, refusing to let the heavy, cumulative weight of his timeline be interrupted or diluted by a bureaucratic non-answer. He then brought up the Massey discharge petition. He recalled how the White House had aggressively characterized the petition's success as an act of outright political hostility. He detailed the disturbing reports that Republican lawmakers who signed the petition had been abruptly summoned to the White House Situation Room. He emphasized that the Situation Room is a highly secure facility strictly reserved for coordinating responses to international crises and national security emergencies, not for bullying lawmakers over domestic transparency disputes. According to the lawmakers who were summoned, political promises were dangled, while severe consequences were heavily implied. Threats regarding district funding were made, and potential primary election challengers were explicitly discussed. All of this intense pressure was applied for one singular purpose: to stop the petition from reaching the 218 signatures required to legally force the unsealing of the Epstein documents. Then, Moskowitz leaned forward. It was a minuscule physical adjustment, but its impact was massive. He finally delivered the ultimate question that had been simmering beneath every word he had spoken thus far. "Were you there?" he asked simply. He wanted to know if the Attorney General was present in the room when the executive branch intimidated elected members of Congress to suppress the release of the Epstein files. Pam Bondi opened her mouth. She paused. She shot a quick, desperate glance at the legal counsel sitting directly to her right. The attorney offered absolutely no whispered advice or lifeline. In that agonizingly suspended fraction of time, the total lack of sound became the most deafening statement in the entire building. Measured by a clock, the silence was brief. Measured by the brutal metrics of Washington politics, it felt like an eternity. In the realm of high-stakes oversight, a hesitation is virtually never an accident, and the empty spaces between words often reveal far more than the words themselves. Bondi finally broke the freeze, shifting awkwardly in her seat and shuffling pieces of paper that did not need to be shuffled. She was buying precious seconds that provided no actual escape route. Through that tiny, transparent choreography of delay, everyone watching understood that Moskowitz's question had struck a devastatingly vital nerve. Moskowitz did not jump in to rescue her from the awkward silence. He was a master of pacing, fully aware that showing restraint can escalate pressure far more effectively than shouting over someone. He let the glaring absence of a clear, immediate denial hang over the room, because in congressional hearings, the inability to produce a straightforward answer always carries more catastrophic weight than a polished, rehearsed lie. When he finally resumed speaking, his voice was still steady. He sounded neither arrogant nor aggressive, just razor sharp, emboldened by the undeniable reality that his trap had been perfectly laid. He reminded the silent committee that despite the administration's aggressive intimidation tactics, the discharge petition successfully acquired the mandatory 218 signatures. It succeeded not because of blind party loyalty, but by forming a massive veto-proof majority that backed the administration into an inescapable corner. The petition did not pass because it was an easy political win. It passed because lawmakers across the entire ideological spectrum finally realized that continuing to hide the files had become entirely indefensible in the face of massive public outrage. Moskowitz hammered home the fact that the administration did not offer this transparency willingly out of the goodness of their hearts. They were forced into it. They were legally compelled by the legislative branch of government, overpowered by sheer voting numbers that rendered any presidential veto threats completely useless. He highlighted the extraordinary reality that nearly every single representative in the House, with only one exception alongside the entire United States Senate, had united to force the disclosure. This was an almost impossible level of unanimous alignment in a government historically defined by bitter gridlock. In a deeply divided capital where true agreement is incredibly rare, that level of bipartisan force was staggering, and he ensured the Attorney General felt the full gravity of that historic unity. Pam Bondi managed to maintain her physical composure, but the muscles in her jaw visibly clenched. It was a subconscious physical tell, revealing her understanding that the rhetorical walls were closing in rapidly. Moskowitz smoothly transitioned his focus away from the administration's procedural roadblocks and moved directly onto sworn legal testimony. He shifted the battlefield from political strategy to statements made under the severe penalty of perjury. Because while political motives can be endlessly debated, lying under oath is a tangible crime. He specifically cited the prior testimony given by Kash Patel before Senator Kennedy. Patel had categorically, confidently stated on the record that the intelligence agencies possessed absolutely no credible evidence suggesting that Epstein exploited or transported young women for anyone other than himself. The specific phrasing Patel used was highly calculated, narrow, and absolute. At the time it was delivered, it seemed perfectly engineered to kill public speculation and shut down any further journalistic digging. Moskowitz chose not to scream or act dramatically outraged by the blatant contradiction that followed, simply because the facts did all the heavy lifting for him. The documents that were ultimately dragged into the public light definitively proved that the exploitation was absolutely not a solo operation. An extensive, horrifying international network existed. It involved multiple countries, high-end agencies, and powerful intermediaries whose dark roles were not just conspiracy theories, but heavily documented realities. Vulnerable young women had been actively sourced from Poland, the Czech Republic, and Russia. They were pulled from prestigious modeling agencies in Paris. They were even targeted in seemingly innocent summer camp environments where calculated manipulation was disguised under the noble banner of professional mentorship. Every single one of these sickening revelations completely obliterated Patel's sworn testimony. Moskowitz maintained a chillingly calm demeanor as he listed these facts, proving that true power lies in cold, hard contrast, not in screaming. He then pivoted to Ghislaine Maxwell's explosive revelation. She had stated that exactly 29 high-profile associates of Epstein had secretly entered into confidential agreements with the Department of Justice. The very existence of these shadowy agreements heavily implied deep knowledge, active complicity, or at the bare minimum, desperate legal negotiations to stay out of prison. The infamous list that the administration had vehemently denied possessing was now backed by unredacted names and heavily documented co-conspirators listed in official legal paperwork. The administration's favorite defensive phrase, "there is no list," had completely lost its protective armor. Moskowitz let this massive implication echo through the chamber without adding his own subjective commentary, allowing the undeniable public record to speak loudly on his behalf. He casually mentioned Maxwell's desperate, stated willingness to trade even more prominent names in exchange for legal clemency. This offer further destroyed the government's false narrative that the public already knew everything. The piling up of these grim details didn't feel like a political performance. It felt like a prosecutor meticulously laying out a lethal case file in front of a captive jury. Bondi barely moved, lightly touching her microphone as if preparing to mount a defense. However, Moskowitz kept talking, not to silence her out of disrespect, but because the structural integrity of his argument relied on an unbroken, relentless rhythm. He circled back to Patel's testimony once more. This time, he zeroed in on Patel's sworn claim that the former president's name appeared in the Epstein documents fewer than 100 times. The fully unsealed documents aggressively proved this number to be entirely false. Moskowitz didn't even bother to dress up the discrepancy with angry adjectives. He just placed the sworn words directly next to the printed truth. It was precisely at this moment that he reached down and produced a heavy Bible, one distinctly embossed with the former president's name in shining gold letters. It was an object destined to become an iconic symbol of the hearing within seconds. He lifted it up, not waving it around like a circus barker, but holding it with purposeful, steady clarity so that every single camera lens could perfectly focus on the golden cover and his deadpan expression. He calmly informed the room that the former president's name showed up in the Epstein files significantly more times than the word God appeared in the entire Holy Bible. That specific sentence sliced through the dense air of the committee room, sparking a wave of pure disbelief and involuntary physical reactions. Shocked gasps audibly erupted from the public gallery. A few lawmakers let out stifled, uncomfortable laughs, acutely aware of the sheer rhetorical savagery of the comparison. For one blinding second, the gathering felt less like a congressional hearing and more like an absolute unmasking. Moskowitz didn't pause to let the audience enjoy the shock value because he wasn't trying to be funny. It was a highly calculated linguistic device, a brilliant way to condense a massive, dry numerical contradiction into a stunning visual metaphor that the media could not possibly ignore. He immediately followed up with a second, equally sharp comparison. He noted that the president's name was found in the dark files more often than the name Harry Potter appeared across all 7 of the famous fantasy novels. On the surface, the comparison sounded absurd, but it harbored a deeply serious implication. When a name is repeated that many times in criminal documentation, it is not a casual coincidence. It is a profound indicator of deep involvement. He set the Golden Bible back onto his desk with slow, deliberate care. He didn't slam it down. He didn't wave his arms. He just let the heavy visual metaphor permanently brand itself into the room's consciousness. He then aggressively shifted his crosshairs onto Howard Lutnick. He brought up Lutnick's past public statements regarding a 2008 visit to Epstein's luxurious residence, where Lutnick admitted to seeing a massage table prominently displayed in the living room. It was an incredibly bizarre detail that naturally generated far more horrifying questions than it answered. Lutnick had publicly claimed that Epstein boasted about receiving daily massages, specifically noting they were the right kind of massage, a phrasing dripping with dark, unspoken implications. According to Lutnick's own defensive narrative, he and his wife were so disturbed by this 2008 encounter that they vowed never to be in the same room with Epstein again, framing their decision as a stance of profound moral superiority. And yet, Moskowitz pointed out, travel documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that in 2012, several years after Epstein had already pleaded guilty to highly publicized criminal charges, Lutnick and his entire family were physically present on Epstein's private island. This fact completely obliterated his curated story of permanent moral distancing. Moskowitz delivered this contradiction with brutal simplicity, adding a personal note that as a father from Florida, when he wanted to take his family on vacation, he took them to Disney World, not to a notorious billionaire's private exploitation island. The committee chamber didn't erupt in chaotic shouting. Instead, it fell into a state of stunned, paralyzed realization. Attorney General Bondi's posture went rigidly straight, yet she refused to interrupt. She likely calculated that fighting back in that specific moment would only magnify the devastating blow. Unrelenting, Moskowitz moved on to cite internal documents that directly contradicted the president's boastful, repeated claims that he had personally, heroically kicked Epstein out of his private club. Moskowitz quoted statements from the club's own management that painted a drastically different, far less heroic reality. Every single piece of evidence he presented hammered away at the exact same undeniable theme. The polished public stories and the hidden, documented timelines were in complete and utter opposition. At this juncture, the proceedings had sailed far past the boundaries of routine government oversight. They had entered the dangerous terminal waters of institutional credibility. And in Washington, once credibility is publicly shattered, it is almost impossible to magically restore. The journalists in the room had stopped typing altogether. They were just staring, exchanging wide-eyed looks that acknowledged they were witnessing a historic dismantling. Moskowitz never raised his voice. He never resorted to nasty personal venom. He simply functioned as a mason, stacking one undeniable contradiction on top of another, building a wall of guilt until the only available options were a detailed explanation or a desperate defensive attack. Pam Bondi's sustained silence during these critical, crushing moments communicated a reality far louder than any pre-written PR statement ever could. In the unforgiving arena of congressional oversight, absolute clarity is the only currency that matters, and hesitation is the ultimate indicator of a bankrupt defense. The ambient temperature in the room seemingly plummeted, not due to the building's climate control, but because a cold, Hard tension always replaces warmth when powerful political alliances are fractured in broad daylight. Moskowitz wasn't done yet, but the trajectory of his argument had funneled down to one inescapable final destination. It was a turn that would definitively test whether the nation's top law enforcement officer would answer directly or attempt to blindingly redirect the spotlight. He had successfully mapped out the administration's obstruction. He had dragged false sworn testimony into the light. He had highlighted massive numerical discrepancies. He had placed hollow public PR statements directly next to damning flight logs. Now his entire case rested not on clever political rhetoric, but on an unbroken chain of sequential evidence. When he paused to take a breath, it wasn't for theatrical flair. It was to let the sheer, suffocating volume of accumulation settle onto the shoulders of everyone in the room. In that brief window of quiet, every single camera lens seemed to physically lean closer to the witness table. Pam Bondi nervously adjusted her massive binder one final time. The bright, colorful tabs that had initially projected an aura of intimidating preparedness now looked less like a protective shield and more like a desperate pile of hidden evidence waiting to be ripped open. Moskowitz's next move wasn't going to be about flight logs, math, or timelines. It was going to be about motive. And in the dark arts of politics, exposing motive is always the most explosive, volatile terrain to navigate. Moskowitz let the heavy stillness stretch out just a fraction of a second longer. It wasn't because he was nervous, but because in high-stakes political warfare, timing is everything. When an audience has just absorbed contradiction after contradiction, the next lethal blow doesn't need to be loud to cause maximum devastation. He seamlessly shifted his crosshairs from documenting what the government had said and released to questioning exactly what they had withheld, and more importantly, why. Once a massive pattern of inconsistencies is established as fact, uncovering the hidden motive becomes the unavoidable inquiry. He implied, without any dramatic hand gestures, that the core issue was no longer whether the files existed. The terrifying issue was whether those files had been intentionally delayed, heavily curated, and aggressively protected to deliberately shield highly specific, powerful names from facing public scrutiny. Bondi sat perfectly upright, keeping her shoulders aggressively squared to project an illusion of total steadiness. However, the visible tightness gripping her facial muscles proved that she knew the exchange had crossed the line from standard PR messaging into severe, personal risk. Moskowitz made it crystal clear that his crusade had absolutely nothing to do with securing a cheap political advantage. It was entirely about fighting for the basic, survival-level credibility of America's institutions. He stated that the Department of Justice does not belong to any sitting administration. It belongs exclusively to the blind rule of law itself. He ruthlessly revisited the administration's hollow bragging about championing transparency. He reminded everyone present that true transparency does not mean selectively disclosing favorable documents. It means executing a total unredacted release when the public interest demands it. He hammered home the reality that the administration had fought the release of these critical documents tooth and nail, right up until the exact second Congress forced its hand. He noted that resisting the truth with such ferocity makes it entirely impossible to reconcile with declarations of total openness. He aggressively emphasized that the veto-proof majority that forced her hand was not a hypothetical political theory. It was a devastating reality. The White House only signed off on the measure because they were politically trapped and entirely powerless to block it, not because they suddenly embraced it. In a legislative body that is famously bitterly fractured by extreme ideology, the fact that nearly every single representative united to force this unsealing proved that the rot went far beyond standard party lines. That level of unified action, he suggested, was not a partisan rebellion. It was the sound of the institution pulling the emergency alarm. Then he methodically circled back to the radioactive core of the entire scandal, the undeniable presence of highly specific names hidden within the files. He stressed that when a name appears repeatedly in criminal documentation, it raises a mountain of horrific questions that no amount of slick political rhetoric can ever erase. He reiterated that top officials had delivered sworn testimony minimizing the frequency of the president's name, only for the subsequent unsealed truth to reveal a massive discrepancy. This wasn't a minor administrative error regarding optics. This was about the sacred nature of a legal oath. because statements delivered under the penalty of perjury carry severe consequences that extend far beyond a few embarrassing political headlines. Moskowitz never explicitly accused Pam Bondi to her face of committing perjury or active deception. Instead, he framed the terrifying pattern in a way that made passive distance completely impossible. If the Department of Justice was aware of these massive inconsistencies, he strongly implied, then their ongoing silence wasn't a sign of neutrality. It became active, criminal complicity. He briefly returned to Ghislaine Maxwell's explosive statements, noting once again that the specific mention of 29 associates and sealed immunity deals pointed to a massive, protected syndicate, not just a single individual acting alone. The American public had been aggressively assured repeatedly that there was nothing more to see, nothing more to uncover, nothing more to release. Yet every single subsequent document released completely contradicted that false assurance. He let his flawless, brutal logic unfold without adding subjective embellishment. He knew that cold, unfeeling logic delivered with a calm voice is infinitely more unsettling than fake outrage delivered loudly. The hearing room, which had started the day merely attentive, now felt incredibly compressed, as though the oxygen had been entirely replaced with heavy expectation. Bondi's elite legal team sat frozen beside her. No whispered notes slid across the polished wood table. No visible rescue strategies emerged in response to the onslaught. Moskowitz then reminded the room that the president had publicly dismissed the worst exploitation scandal in modern history as a mere hoax, a cheap buzzword that carries rhetorical force but absolutely zero evidentiary weight. When a sitting president calls a mountain of criminal evidence a hoax, he suggested it does not magically eliminate the documentation. It simply attempts to brainwash and reframe public perception. He reminded the room of the insane reality that the president had even attacked his own loyal supporters for demanding the further release of the files. It was a remarkable, bizarre inversion in which advocates for basic transparency were suddenly treated as enemy adversaries. That inversion, Moskowitz implied, was the ultimate proof of deep systemic anxiety, not executive confidence. He again invoked the terrifying image of the Situation Room, the symbolic, highly secure heart of executive decision-making during international crises. He contrasted its noble, intended purpose with its alleged corrupt use to pressure and threaten legislators over domestic document disclosure. If elected members were indeed summoned into that room and warned, if their district appropriations were threatened, if vicious political retaliation was implied, then the concept of transparency had officially been weaponized as a threat rather than upheld as a principle. He didn't even bother asking a new question at this point because the crushing weight of what he had already established was more than sufficient to carry the room forward. He spoke about institutional credibility not as a cheap partisan asset, but as an absolute national necessity. When the public perceives that the Department of Justice is acting as a shield for elite individuals, trust erodes far beyond the boundaries of any political party. Pam Bondi tried desperately to interject one more time, but Moskowitz continued rolling right over her, his voice remaining terrifyingly steady, refusing to escalate into a shouting match, but absolutely refusing to retreat an inch. He shifted back to the symbolic moment that had drawn shocked gasps earlier, the golden Trump Bible resting ominously on the desk between them. He clarified that his brutal comparison about the frequency of names was not a mockery of religious scripture, but a necessary, shocking commentary on documented repetition. Numbers and math, unlike metaphors, do not possess a political ideology. Still, the visual damage was already deeply embedded in the narrative, and he fully expected that the administration's spin doctors would attempt to reframe his factual comparison as religious disrespect rather than a documentation of truth. He pivoted seamlessly from metaphor back to the cold, hard record, reiterating that his fundamental question was not about personal faith, but about hidden files. The Bible had been utilized as a prop only insofar as it perfectly illustrated the concept of scale. And scale matters deeply when assessing whether a criminal presence is merely incidental or deeply systemically structural. Then he turned his sights back to Howard Lutnick, drawing sharp attention to the bizarre timeline of his supposed moral distancing versus his documented physical presence on the island. Actions taken after a highly publicized criminal conviction carry incredibly different implications than those taken before. He did not willfully speculate on the dark motives for the 2012 visit to Epstein Island. He simply brutally juxtaposed that visit with Lutnick's prior sanctimonious statements about never again sharing a room with the man. The stark contrast required zero embellishment, because basic consistency is the standard by which all human credibility is ultimately measured. He mentioned again the internal documents, disputing the president's boastful claim that he had personally expelled Epstein from his private club, emphasizing that the accounts of the club's own manager simply did not align with that heroic narrative. Every single contradiction, every blatant inconsistency, every chronological gap he exposed formed part of a massive pattern that now seemed far less accidental and far more aggressively structural. The hearing had moved completely beyond the realm of individual, nitpicky questions and into a massive existential inquiry about whether the administration had actively resisted disclosure to protect specific elite reputations. Moskowitz leaned back slightly in his leather chair, a subtle physical cue signaling that the arc of his demolition was nearing its final apex. He reminded Pam Bondi that his line of questioning was not an attack on her past public service. It was not a dismissal of her stellar record in Florida, nor was it a denial of the genuine, shared moments they experienced during times of crisis. It was, he firmly stated, about whether doing the right thing one time grants you a permanent license to avoid doing the right thing ever again, simply because it becomes politically inconvenient. The stark distinction between personal gratitude and necessary silence resurfaced, sharper now than ever, because remaining silent in the face of massive contradiction eventually becomes an endorsement by default. He returned to the undeniable fact that he was a Republican lawmaker addressing a Republican attorney general, underscoring that this intense exchange could never be dismissed as standard partisan hostility. When fierce accountability arises from within your own party rather than from your sworn opponents, it carries a vastly different, far heavier moral weight. He made it crystal clear that he was not interested in scoring cheap points against Democrats or blindly defending them. His only interest was in defending the survival and credibility of institutions that must outlast any single presidential administration. Pam Bondi's physical composure held, but the glaring absence of any substantive, factual rebuttal began to define the entire exchange far more than any individual statement she could have made. Moskowitz paused again, and in that heavy pause, the narrative turned sharply toward what would become the absolute defining challenge of the entire afternoon. He glanced down at the massive binder sitting right in front of Pam Bondi, thick with colorful tabs that suggested total preparedness for a vicious political confrontation. His next move would not involve another dry statistic or another timeline contradiction. It would be something far more personal, far more immediate, and infinitely more difficult to deflect. The room intuitively sensed it before he even opened his mouth. It was that terrifying shift in the atmosphere when dry documentation gives way to raw, personal exposure. He straightened up slightly, adjusted his papers without breaking eye contact, and prepared to brutally redirect the spotlight from the hidden files to the dark preparation hiding behind those files. The hearing was no longer simply about whether documents existed or whether sworn testimony aligned with reality. It was now about whether the Department of Justice had actively prepared to counterattack and destroy the very legislators who dared to demand transparency. And that specific question, once spoken aloud into the microphone, would place Pam Bondi in an impossible position, where any answer she gave carried catastrophic consequences. Moskowitz shifted his focus from the documentation to the exposure, with deliberate, icy control, keeping his tone perfectly measured as he directed everyone's attention toward the massive binder resting right in front of the Attorney General. He noted the limited time remaining on the clock and stated that he was incredibly curious about exactly what kind of opposition material the government had assembled on him. He framed the devastating request as a polite inquiry rather than a screaming accusation. He calmly asked her to turn to the specific section labeled with his name and read out loud what had been prepared, adding with a touch of cold sarcasm that he would happily evaluate its quality as though judging a school competition. The suggestion was entirely disarming in its calm delivery, but utterly disruptive in its implication. It forcefully moved the conversation away from the Epstein files and shined a blinding light onto the internal retaliatory posture of the Department of Justice toward congressional oversight itself. Every single camera lens in the chamber tightened its frame, recognizing instantly that this was no longer a debate about documents that had already been released. This was a live exposure of preparations currently concealed from public view. If that heavy binder contained targeted opposition research aimed at an elected lawmaker pressing for legal disclosure, that horrifying fact would reveal dark priorities that completely contradicted the department's sworn stance of neutrality. If no such smear material existed, simply opening the binder and proving it would end the entire matter instantly. The choice he presented was brilliantly straightforward in appearance, but deeply, dangerously layered in consequence. Pam Bondi remained frozen still for a moment, her eyes perfectly steady, her jaw tightly set, furiously evaluating which path carried the least amount of political damage. She did not reach out for the binder. Instead, she took the coward's way out and redirected the focus back to the symbolic element of their earlier exchange. She stated with manufactured outrage that nothing about religious scripture should ever be treated lightly, and that raising the Trump-branded Bible in that specific context crossed a line of decency. She characterized his factual comparison as deeply offensive and firmly stated she would not entertain humor directed at a sacred text. Her response completely bypassed his devastating request entirely, centering on hurt feelings and tone rather than addressing the substance of a government cover-up. Moskowitz absorbed the attempted shift without a single flicker of visible agitation. He did not take the bait and escalate, nor did he retreat an inch from the underlying, terrifying issue. He simply smiled, a cold smile, and asked her one last time which attack file on that binder was the strongest, politely reiterating his interest in seeing exactly what the government had compiled against him. The inquiry remained completely unanswered. The clock hit 0. Time expired. The 5-minute window permanently closed, without the massive binder ever opening, without a single confirmation or denial of its dark contents, and without any acknowledgement of whether government investigative energy had been weaponized to discredit a member of Congress simply for seeking transparency. What remained in the room was not a shouted, chaotic confrontation, but a damning choice made in real time about what to address and what to desperately avoid. Pam Bondi had actively opted to frame the exchange around religious decorum rather than addressing a documented criminal chronology. That specific choice carried its own devastating interpretation. In standard oversight proceedings, the factual substance of a question typically dictates the response. Yet here, the focus was aggressively shifted to symbolism and hurt feelings, while the crushing timeline and the perjured sworn statements remained completely untouched. The hearing room did not erupt into chaos, it simply absorbed the reality. Every observer present understood that the absolute refusal to engage with the underlying request signaled a massive strategic containment effort. Moskowitz gathered his papers calmly and leaned back in his chair. He didn't look triumphant. He looked resolved. Having successfully placed the ultimate unanswerable question onto the permanent public record. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, yet it completely reframed the national narrative from a standard partisan clash into a terrifying, institutional tension occurring entirely within the same political party. A Republican lawmaker had methodically, brutally outlined massive contradictions, invoked false sworn testimony, highlighted the unstoppable congressional force behind the disclosure, and concluded his masterclass by testing whether oversight itself had triggered illegal, defensive countermeasures inside the highest levels of the Department of Justice. The Attorney General's final reply did not dispute his timeline. It did not clarify the massive numerical discrepancies. It did not address the horrifying Situation Room allegations. And it absolutely did not open the binder. It only addressed personal offense. In the unforgiving calculus of public perception, that distinction matters deeply. When arguments entirely centered on logical sequence, hard documentation, and legal oaths are met with a response focused solely on religious propriety, viewers instantly draw their own conclusions about which terrain the government feels is safest to defend. This confrontation did not rely on screaming volume or cheap theatrics to achieve its historic impact. It relied entirely on the brutal contrast between a documented record and a panicked reaction. Within minutes of the gavel dropping, the video clip circulated wildly beyond standard ideological echo chambers, specifically because the unique dynamic completely defied easy, partisan labeling. The true significance extended far beyond just one afternoon hearing. It clearly demonstrated how internal dissent carries a vastly different, heavier weight than external, expected opposition, particularly when raised by a respected member who had previously collaborated closely with the Attorney General on matters of life, death, and legislation. Moskowitz had brilliantly prefaced his entire challenge by openly acknowledging their shared history, separating his personal respect for her past actions from his necessary institutional scrutiny of her current ones. That brilliant distinction permanently shielded his critique from being lazily dismissed as opportunistic partisan hostility. The final result was not a media spectacle, but a terrifying exposure of the massive divergence between a government's declared transparency and its observed panicked resistance. The heavy silence regarding the binder question lingered in the air far longer than any spoken sentence of the day. In the brutal arena of politics, unanswered inquiries often scream much louder than polished, prepared remarks. The chamber eventually returned to its standard procedural rhythm after the exchange concluded, yet the very atmosphere of the room remained permanently altered. A massive internal fissure had been placed in full public view, not through nasty insults, but through a methodical, suffocating sequencing of facts, culminating in a final inquiry that forced an impossible strategic choice. Pam Bondi's physical composure may have held together, but the historical narrative now forever included a moment where hard substance was cowardly sidestepped and fake symbolism was pushed to the foreground. For observers truly attentive to the dark dynamics of powerful institutions, that specific moment perfectly crystallized the eternal tension between blind loyalty and true accountability. The exchange fiercely underscored that transparency compelled by a legislative majority with a gun to the executive's head vastly differs from transparency volunteered willingly by executive initiative. It clearly highlighted how sworn statements, once utterly destroyed by unsealed documents, invite a level of scrutiny that simply cannot be neutralized by complaining about someone's tone of voice. It perfectly illustrated how relentless oversight coming from within a political coalition completely complicates lazy narratives of partisan attack. And most importantly, it left a terrifying question forever unresolved regarding the dark contents of an opposition binder that remained firmly closed. 5 minutes can easily compress months of political maneuvering into a single, devastating visual record. On February 11th, that compression occurred not through raised voices or pounding fists, but through selective, cowardly engagement. The public record now permanently included a documented, undeniable chronology, direct references to perjured sworn testimony, the proud acknowledgement of unstoppable bipartisan legislative pressure, and a final, lethal request that tested whether the mere scrutiny of power triggers retaliatory, defensive preparation. The government's absolute refusal to engage with that final request did not end the matter. It placed the entire cover-up in much sharper, terrifying relief. True accountability in democratic systems does not hinge solely on the polished answers provided. It relies heavily on the dangerous questions that are declined. The hearing eventually adjourned. Yet the exchange continued to circulate wildly as undeniable evidence of an internal, institutional challenge rather than a standard external attack. In that sense, the most consequential and devastating element of the entire afternoon was not a brilliant metaphor involving scripture, nor was it a shocking numerical comparison. It was the terrifying moment when a closed, colorful binder became vastly more visible and damning than any single page it might have contained.